The Anthropology Department at Johns Hopkins welcomes you to the 6th annual Sidney W. Mintz Lecture. The Mintz Lecture, which honors Professor Sidney Mintz for his contribution to anthropology and to the Hopkins Department, is always an event for us. Tonight's lecture even more so, because of its circumstances and because of the speaker. Professor Mintz is retiring and has been conferred emeritus status by the Academic Council of this university. We have thanked Sid on numerous occasions for his service to the department he helped create in 1974-75. We thank him again today. And yes, he's going to stick around Macaulay Hall. I ask you to stand up for a minute in his honor. This lecture is also special because it is the first Mintz lecture not to be delivered by an anthropologist. From the very beginning, this department hoped that the Mintz lecture series would branch out beyond anthropology to embrace the whole of the human disciplines. We wanted this branching out not to abandon anthropology, but to gain a better perspective on issues that are dear to anthropologists. We also wanted this first lecture by a non-anthropologist to be a date in the history of our department. I think we succeeded. Indeed, the last and not the least reason why the 6th Sidney Mintz lecture will remain a date in our history is that our speaker tonight is Professor Noam Chomsky of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The title of his lecture is Ourselves as the Other. A department chair has probably one chance in a lifetime to introduce Noam Chomsky. The temptations are obvious. One could try to situate Professor Chomsky's place in the intellectual thought and political life of our time. One could insist on unknown fact. Did you know that Chomsky's father was a Hopkins undergraduate? One could even raise obvious questions about the relation between his linguistics and his political commitments. One could even, heavens forbid, try a synopsis of his political philosophy or a summary of his life work. I will avoid making a fool of myself during my 5 minutes of fame and spare you the embarrassment of my trying to do in such a short time what others have done quite well and not so quite well in hundreds of pages. Thus, I'd rather tell you a story. I was in Harvard Square a few weeks ago looking for a cab. I found one. Not surprisingly to those of you who know Cambridge, the driver was Haitian. On our way to the airport, we chatted in Haitian Creole about different things. As we moved from topic to topic, my driver volunteered his opinion about these Harvard people who get into his cab. They have nothing to do with us, of course, he said. But there's this guy at MIT. I went to hear him talk about Haiti just a few days ago. He makes sense. Perhaps you know him, Chomsky, something like that. I said, yes, I know. It is a measure of Professor Chomsky's reach that a black immigrant cab driver in Boston recognizes in him something that makes sense. something close to home at the very moment that home is uncertain or indeed undefined. Few academics anywhere, certainly few US academics, can make similar claims. But that is as much a testimony of Professor Chomsky's greatness as it is a sad confirmation of the distance we build between ivory halls and the street, between writing and speech, between us and others. Mentions of otherness make anthropologists salivate. In a narrow way, we anthropologists are the specialists of foreignness, the privileged scholars of the savage slot. We carry a responsibility in presenting the other to the societies in which we live. There are debates on the means and nature of that responsibility, on the utility of this presentation of otherness. Clifford Geertz's famous sentence expresses one pole of the spectrum. If we wanted home foods, we should have stayed at home. Anthropologists want strange truths, and often enough for good old familiar reasons. After all, Geertz's remark comes from a lecture in defense of cultural relativism. But what if the distance between the home and the elsewhere is less precise than our measures for it? What if the line between the two is not a straight one? What if we reverse the positions? Indeed, what if home itself is strange and the truths about it uncomfortable? Perhaps the challenge is to escape from our alleged familiarity and discover otherness. Which otherness? We would need to question the very intuitiveness we use to set up boundaries between various selves and various others, between humans and nature, between language and thought, between thought and action. We would need to question the familiarity of the borders between the first world and the third, between the US and its backyard, between the third world far away and the third world right here at home. Is this too wide an agenda? Perhaps. But it is an agenda worth sketching, especially if the sketch comes to us from one of the most extraordinary minds and most provocative minds of this century, Professor Noam Chomsky.
I want to speak about the problem of understanding ourselves, that is, grasping home truths, as they're sometimes called. Since the origins of recorded Western culture, I don't know enough about others to say, willingness to face the problem has been regarded as a standard by which honesty and integrity are judged. Some have held the question to be the hardest one that we can pose. There's an equally venerable tradition that takes the opposite stance, that such questions are uniquely penetrable. There are also some fair and simple ways to assess the human significance of understanding oneself. One crucial measure is the power one wields over others, and to the extent that the social order is under popular control, the power and influence of its institutions, state and private. Well, the moral issues are transparent, and I won't talk about them. The reasons why they're so seldom addressed is not very much more obscure, addressed from within at least. Reflecting on Caribbean studies, Sidney Mintz once commented on the study of power, the neglect of which has been noticeable in anthropology. He identified plantation societies as an unusually clear example, precisely because in them those who ruled were so rarely called to account. which was no small oversight when we consider the human catastrophes in which they played a crucial role with enormous effects on modern history, as he's so greatly illuminated in his own work. The masters of plantation society, in fact, were finally called to account, but not within them, rather by those who fought and overthrew them. And that's an old story. King Ahab was not called to account by the false prophets who were the respectable intellectuals of his day. And the same holds for the study of power quite generally. It's critically analyzed from outside, very rarely within. Hardly a day passes without striking illustrations. So a couple of weeks ago, there was a front page article in the New York Times, a headline, "Making Sure War Crimes Are Not Forgotten." It discussed President Clinton's new ambassador at large on war crimes issues, whose task is to see that such crimes do not fade into history. And then a series of examples are given of such crimes. If you run through them, they share one interesting feature. They can all be charged to someone else's account. There are some gaps that come to mind. So noticeably missing from the list, for example, are some 5 million corpses in the ruined countries of Indochina, even the thousands of children and farmers who are still being killed every year by unexploded anti-personnel ordnance in Laos. That's part of the legacy of one of the most vicious assaults against a civilian society in modern history. These topics are not missing because of lack of interest. Just yesterday, I guess, you may have noticed in the Times a story, magazine's story headed headline, "Vietnam resurfaces as a hot topic on American campuses." And then it discusses this hot topic. The interest in it, according to the report at least, is restricted to the travail of Americans. Really hot topic, plainly something missing. Missing also are hundreds of thousands of victims of international terrorist wars in Central America in the years that followed. Wars that were organized and directed by the regional superpower, in large part wars directed against the church, which was being punished for having adopted the preferential option for the poor and for its attempts to help oppressed people fighting for their most fundamental human rights. It's the words of Archbishop Romero, who was pleading in vain with Washington to end its support for the military junta, which added him to the grim list a few days later. It's more than symbolic that the terrible decade of the 1980s opened with the murder of an archbishop who had become a voice for the voiceless, as his flock called him, and closed with the assassination of 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals who had chosen the same path. In each case, murdered by terrorist forces that were armed and trained by those who now sit augustly in judgment over the crimes of others. One should incidentally take careful note of the fact that the Archbishop and the leading Central American dissident intellectuals were doubly assassinated. We took part in that assassination in a number of ways. First they were murdered, and then they were silenced. Their words, indeed their very existence, are scarcely known in the United States, unlike dissidents in enemy states who are greatly honored, which I presume is another cultural universal. We rightly admire the church for its role in opposing Soviet tyranny in the 1980s. And we cannot permit ourselves to see that in those very same years, the same church undertook a far more difficult task, facing incomparably greater violence and terror within the domains of the world-dominant superpower. That's a pretty remarkable fact, I think, illustrating the barriers we erect to understanding ourselves and calling to account the power in which we share. There are unfortunately all too many other examples. Well, stepping back from the ugly facts themselves, there are two ways to approach this array of topics. The first one is to try to clarify what the issues are. The second is to deal with them. There's a considerable body of material in print that undertakes the second of those tasks. How well it succeeds, you can judge for yourselves. I'm not even going to try to barely touch on that matter that requires volumes, not a talk. Rather, what I'll try to do is much more modest, to discuss at least to examine some of the questions that arise, and to indicate some of the conclusions that seem to me at least to come into focus when we pursue these paths. So imagine a rational Martian scientist who's observing earthly affairs. He would see that in the last flick of an eye of the evolution of life, a strange creature emerged, radically different from any other. It's the only creature with anything remotely like human language, the only creature with a history, with cultural variety of any complexity, even with huge numbers in very recent years. The isolation is so extreme and the variation is so limited that some leading evolutionary biologists, Richard Noam of Harvard for one, have argued that we will never learn anything much about the evolution of human mental faculties because the kind of data on which such studies can be pursued simply does not exist. The Martian might discover that not only the evolution of these remarkable mental faculties, but even their essential nature might be beyond the grasp of human science. That's not a new idea. Descartes, at the foundations of contemporary cognitive science, I think one can say, argued that the distinctive property of humans is freedom of choice, what he called the noblest thing we can have and all that truly belongs to us, a core feature of human mental nature. So unlike machines, people are only incited and inclined, but not compelled to act in Cartesian terminology. But the nature of active mind is incomprehensible to us, Descartes speculated. We may not have intelligence enough, he wrote, to comprehend how free action can be indeterminate, although the facts are as clear as anything we know. Nothing that has been discovered since challenges his basic contention. There's little reason to suppose that a serious predictive science of behavior is attainable even in principle, although much can be learned about how people are incited and inclined, and much can be done to incite and incline them. That latter enterprise has been undertaken with great energy. In the United States, over $1 trillion a year, which is 1/6 of gross domestic product, is devoted to the task of inciting and inclining. It's in large part manipulation of attitudes, thought, and behavior. Advertising alone, which is just one part of that, runs at almost $350 billion annually worldwide, and it's expected to explode with the new opportunities that are offered by privatization of the internet. Like most technology, it was designed and developed at public expense and initiative for several decades, and has just now been transferred to private hands with the general expectation that large parts of it will be set aside for internal business operations, and most of the rest for inciting and inclining the population to approach the utopian ideal, a society based on a dyad consisting of a person and the tube, with little threat of disruption of concentrated power by thinking and cooperating beings. These estimates of scale do not include what its proponents call the engineering of consent, the essence of democracy, according to leading currents of progressive contemporary thought, to which I'll briefly return. Descartes' skepticism actually ran far deeper, although he still largely accepted the faith that animated early modern science, that we can at least come to understand the material world. Modern science, from Galileo, sought to expunge the mysticism of a neo-scholastic doctrine. It tried to show that apart from mind, the world is a machine, functioning by the self-evident principles of what was called the mechanical philosophy, what we would now call mechanical science. It ridiculed occult qualities, which are, quoting, so great an absurdity that I believe no sensible person can ever fall into it. The words are Newton's, but they refer to his own startling conclusion that the self-evident principles are false, though no less mystical than the sympathies and antipathies of the scholastics. Gravity, he was forced to conclude, does really exist. Newton had no physical explanation of it at all, to contemporary historians of science point out accurately. A deeply troubling problem for him and eminent scientists of his day, who correctly, I'm still quoting, correctly accused Newton of reintroducing occult qualities with no physical material substrate that human beings can understand. To the end of his life, Newton sought to escape the absurdity, as did many others in years that followed, but in vain. Nothing has lessened the force of David Hume's judgment that by refuting the self-evident mechanical philosophy, Newton restored nature's ultimate secrets to that obscurity in which they ever did and ever will remain. We can try to overcome factors that distort our vision, but we cannot become different kinds of minds or escape the limits and perspectives of our own. That's with regard to the so-called material world. Well, where does that leave the study of mind, coming a step closer to the topic here? There's no answer to that question because there's no question. The body-mind distinction was a respectable scientific topic in the early phases of the modern scientific revolution, but not since Newton destroyed the mechanical philosophy, and with it, any coherent notion of body or physical or material, hence any notion of what lies outside its bounds. There's just the world with its various aspects, mechanical, optical, chemical, mental, and others. It's common to ridicule mentalists, so-called, for believing in a ghost in the machine, but the charge is mistaken. Newton exorcised the machine, not the ghost. He left that in place, untouched. The world simply is not a machine. It does not operate by principles comprehensible to human understanding, as Newton, for one, was well aware. Save time and stop talking about this interesting topic. But the conclusion should be, I think, that since the 17th century, it's been understood that all we can do is try to gain a grasp of the world as best we can, recognizing that there can be no secure foundations for knowledge. That was understood 3 centuries ago, and that even the most elementary experience is a construction of our modes of cognition, and that true understanding of the kind that inspired the early scientific revolution is a chimera. And recognizing as well that by lowering their sights, the sciences have achieved spectacular feats of understanding in a lesser sense, but only in a few areas. When we turn to human affairs, understanding is highly limited, in part perhaps for the Cartesian reasons. The role of human will is immeasurable and perhaps beyond our comprehension. The record of prediction in human affairs is hardly impressive, and even retrodiction, that is, attempting to account for what has happened, rarely proceeds far below the surface. Take, for example, the question of economic growth, which is a major contemporary concern. And it's one area where there are at least some tools for understanding, as well as a plethora of data. For the United States, which is the best studied case, 2/3 of the rise of per capita income is attributed to what's called the residual. That's the measure of our ignorance. It's called by Robert Solow, who won the Nobel Prize for his study of the topic. Other estimates range widely, and all numbers have to be taken with a large grain of salt, considering how little is understood and also the narrowness of perspective from which the topics are studied as the academic professions parcel out their tasks, which is an interesting topic in itself. For example, there is a field of economic history and does interesting work. Economic historians have estimated that about half of the emerging textile industry of New England, so the core of the American Industrial Revolution, about half the emerging textile industry would have been destroyed with large-scale effects on the economy generally if the United States had adopted the approved principles of free trade and comparative advantage instead of following the practice of the mother country and borrowing cheaper British textiles exactly as Britain had done to Ireland and India. And the same is true of steel and other industries extending right to the present. Reaganite rugged individualism, as it's called, was extreme in its violation of free trade principles to protect and subsidize U.S. industry, broke all post-war records. Only a few weeks ago, in fact, the Clinton administration barred Japanese supercomputers to protect U.S. manufacturers. The Europeans do exactly the same. But these inquiries, which are interesting, only barely touch on the problem. They don't estimate other effects of state intervention. For example, consider the measures that kept cotton cheap and available in the early Industrial Revolution, hardly by market principles. Or to take a contemporary analog, consider the measures that keep energy cheap and available. It includes a large part of the Pentagon budget. The one technical study I know of the topic estimates that alone is about a 30% subsidy on the price of energy. If such factors are not taken into account, estimates of alleged efficiencies of trade, of factors in growth, of so-called economic health, and so on, are of very limited validity. But a comprehensive picture has no professional or academic home. There's no field where you study this array of topics. You just look at one or another from one or another kind of perspective, getting a very misleading picture of what happened. So, for example, to examine the effects of state intervention in U.S. economic growth by looking at the tariffs that barred British textiles is interesting. But if you don't ask how to count in the extermination of the native population of the southeast United States and the bringing in of slaves, state intervention of a massive kind, you're not talking about the effect of state intervention on economic growth, only some other thing. But that's in another department. Well, I mentioned the modern roots of limits of understanding, of recognition of limits of understanding. There's also a countercurrent which holds the opposite. It holds that our own minds and their achievements should be uniquely open to human inquiry. Maybe the most classic illustration of this is Vico's thesis that the principles that underlie human institutions and culture are found within the modification of our own human minds. Given that claim and the further principle that the contents of our minds are accessible to consciousness, we should have particular ease in understanding these topics. The latter principle, that the contents of our minds are accessible to consciousness, that's one with deep roots in our intellectual tradition. In recent years, it's been elevated virtually to a logical principle in the philosophy of mind. Even Freud doesn't seem to me to have escaped this assumption. To the extent that our minds are accessible to us, then we should be able to understand ourselves, how we think and act, our institutions and their practices, and we ought to be able to do so in ways that transcend our comprehension of the rest of the world, including perhaps the traditional other, those humans who differ from ourselves. Or so it's often been held. The Martian scientist might be skeptical, and with good reason, I think. One interesting example of this line of thinking was developed by one of the founders of Gestalt psychology, Wolfgang Köhler, as he turned from physics to psychology. He argued that when you go to psychology, you're facing novel problems. The reason is that psychology, as you wrote, cannot open up entirely new territories, as the physical sciences have done, because of the familiarity of the phenomena it seeks to explain. Scientific psychology finds that there are no entirely unknown mental facts left which they could have discovered, in contrast to physics, where the most elementary discoveries come as a surprise. The idea is that mental facts are obvious to us once pointed out, although it's important to point them out. As Wittgenstein put it, at the same time, the aspects of things that are most important for us are hidden because of their simplicity and familiarity, and the task of the philosopher is therefore not contributing curiosities, but bringing to our attention the observations that have escaped remark only because they are always before our eyes. Well, these are things I read when I was a student about 50 years ago, and I was not entirely convinced at the time, and have become less so as the years have passed. One reason is that the principle of accessibility to consciousness seems to be very dubious, if even coherent. The inner light of consciousness, whatever it is, casts scattered rays in ways that we don't even begin to understand. Anything that's known about human thought and cognition illustrates this. Human language is a particularly clear example. It's become increasingly clear over the years that we cannot even have the slightest intuitive grasp of the factors that determine how we express our thoughts, what range of variability the system tolerates, even what our words mean. We have to study these topics in pretty much the same way that we study snowflakes or complex molecules or the mammalian visual system or other objects of the natural world from the outside. So the home truths, at least as we begin to understand them, turn out to be strange indeed. Worse still, new problems arise when we try to study ourselves. Mother Nature does not go out of her way to erect barriers to understanding. Notoriously, we do. In part, these are matters of personal defense mechanisms, but human societies have also constructed institutional devices to bar understanding. That $1 trillion a year that I mentioned is one example. Soviet totalitarianism is a familiar case, but actually of a different and, I think, atypical kind. What may be the leading scholarly study of the Russian propaganda state, as the author calls it, concludes that despite the extraordinarily significant role played by indoctrination in forming the state and in executing policy, the Bolsheviks contributed nothing to a theoretical discussion of the techniques of mass persuasion, and were not interested in these techniques, understanding propaganda to be simply political education, providing information. Those are quotes. He also stresses the extreme condescension of the Bolshevik elite toward the Russian people, which he traces back to early writings of Plekhanov and Lenin. I don't know of any attempts to study how well the indoctrination worked, but the limited evidence available suggests that the propaganda was a blunt instrument of rather uncertain impact. Comparisons from the opposite extremes of the 20th century spectrum shed a good deal of light on these matters. In the West, efforts to control thought and attitudes are not only a regular practice, but there also is extensive theoretical discussion of the techniques of mass persuasion, and there's a rich tradition that justifies such control as right, proper, and necessary. Furthermore, the concept of propaganda as information was not a Bolshevik invention. Like many others, including Hitler, the Bolsheviks were deeply impressed by the successes of Anglo-American propaganda during World War I, led by the British Ministry of Information, as it called itself, which secretly defined its task as to direct the thought of most of the world. Its prime concern, of course, was the thought of Americans, for obvious reasons. And here, American intellectuals played an important role, at least by their own assessment, in their leading organ, the New Republic, physics, the liberal progressive intellectuals, Dewey Circle, essentially. In the New Republic, they claim to have carried out the effective and decisive work on behalf of the war, driving the pacifist population to war under the influence of a moral verdict reached after the utmost deliberation by the more thoughtful members of the community, themselves, that is. The new class of intellectuals, as they called themselves, imposed their will upon a, I'm quoting still, imposed their will upon a reluctant or indifferent majority, so they proudly declared, and they did so by such means as disseminating fabrications of the British Ministry of Information about Hun atrocities, unwittingly, no doubt, though the record later emerged. Historians also sought to be mobilized in the cause. They formed the National Board of Historical Service that was to employ the intelligence and skill of the historical workers of the country, in which, quoting, in what one of the founders called historical engineering, explaining the issues of the war that we might better win it. That's an early example of the coordinated and very self-conscious engineering of consent, has echoes in more recent years that are familiar to anthropologists, among others. Washington had its counterpart to Britain's information system, Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information, as it was called. It's the first major state propaganda agency in US history, and in fact the only one until the Reaganites, who were also believers in a very powerful and interventionist state, they tried to duplicate some of its feats with efforts that were described by one high government official as a huge psychological operation of the kind the military conducts to influence a population in denied or enemy territory. That was revealed after they were discovered and declared illegal. Well, the term extreme condescension does not quite apply to the picture of the domestic public as enemy territory, which must be conquered and subdued. But like the information operations of the two great democracies during World War I, the self-image indicates again that Orwellian concepts of information and truth and education are not a specific legacy of totalitarianism. That observation, incidentally, would have come as no surprise to Orwell. His slashing critique of Bolshevik practices in Animal Farm is justly well known, much more so than his preface to the book, which was devoted to thought control under freedom. The sinister fact about literary censorship in England, he wrote, is that it is largely voluntary. Unpopular ideas can be silenced and inconvenient facts kept dark without the need for any official ban. The desired outcome is attained in part by a good education, he said, which instills the general tacit agreement that it wouldn't do to mention that particular fact, or even to think it, we might add. In part, it's a simple consequence of ownership of the press by wealthy men who have every motive to be dishonest on certain important topics. That's Orwell. One reason the preface is less known than the book is that it was not published. It was only discovered in his papers 30 years later. In the West, progressive intellectuals concluded around this period that in order for the rule of the few to survive with the growth of the franchise, which was taking place at the time, it would be necessary to regiment the public mind every bit as much as an army regiments the body of its soldiers. I'm quoting respected New Deal liberal Edward Bernays in his classic manual of the public relations industry called Propaganda. Bernays was drawing upon his experience as a member of Wilson's Committee on Public Information and what he called the astounding success of propaganda during the war, which opened the eyes of the intelligent few to the possibilities of regimenting the public mind. The intelligent minorities, he went on, must now adapt these techniques to the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses. Bernays was also the author of The Doctrine of Engineering of Consent as the Essence of Democracy, and shortly after he presented it, he was honored by the American Psychological Association for these achievements in 1949. Well, the same lessons were drawn in England. The Conservative Party in England, after the First World War, recognized that their papers have just been released, so we know what they were thinking, recognized that the propaganda systems of World War I could be applied, I'm quoting, to the organization of political warfare and political education. It's the way the chairman of the party put it, independently inventing the terms of Bolshevik agitprop. That, they said, might overcome the problem of the broadening of the electorate, which was presumed to be uneducated and largely socialist, and therefore had to be targeted by political warfare or education. Wilsonian intellectuals in the United States drew the same conclusions in what are called his progressive essays on democracy. Walter Lippmann, one of the leading 20th century public intellectuals, also a member of Wilson's propaganda agency, he described a revolution in the practice of democracy as the manufacture of consent has become a self-conscious art and a regular organ of popular government. And it is also, he continued, an essential art because public affairs must be managed by a specialized class of responsible intellectuals who must live free of the trampling and the roar of a bewildered herd, the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders whose function is to be interested spectators of action, not participants. These are all Lippmann's words. The responsible men must be allowed to function in what's nowadays called technocratic insulation in World Bank lingo. The founders of American academic social science drew exactly the same lessons. Harold Lasswell, founders of modern political science, in his entry on propaganda in the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences around the same time, early 30s, he explains that we must not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They are not. We are. Other prominent scholars drew similar conclusions, and so have many others, including the liberal elites of the 1970s, reacting to what they called the crisis of democracy of the 60s, which they observed with dismay. That was their term for the efforts of the normally passive and apathetic sectors of the population to organize and attempt to enter the political arena to pursue their interests, threatening stability and order. Particularly distressing, they concluded, were the failures of what they called the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. The schools, the universities, the churches, and others. And in fact, there has been a major assault since to return them to orthodoxy and obedience. Notice, incidentally, I'm sampling from the liberal end of the political spectrum. It gets harsher when you move to the other. The Leninist flavor of these ideas is unmistakable, but misleading, because they trace back much earlier. During the first modern democratic revolution in England 350 years ago, there's quite an interesting record. I've discussed it elsewhere. The men of best quality, as they called themselves, the responsible men, they warned that the rascal multitude must be protected from their own depraved and corrupt judgment. So they must be controlled for their own good, and their efforts to run their own affairs have to be stopped. Like you stop a 3-year-old from running across the street. So these ideas have also received literary expression, in fact, around the same time, in Pascal's rendition of the practice of the casuists, or later in the logic of Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, who bitterly assailed Christ for offering people freedom and thus condemning them to misery. He explained that the church must vanquish freedom so as to make men happy and provide the absolute submission and community of worship that people crave. In the modern secular age, this translates to worship of the state religion, and in the Western democracies, that incorporates the doctrine of submission to the masters of the publicly subsidized private power system. Inevitable globalization is one of the current mantras with a long history. The more sophisticated modern world moves from literary rendition to self-conscious doctrine. And while intellectuals were developing the theory of controlling the public mind in order to deter the threat of democracy and to protect people from themselves, the business world was acting to develop programs on the Wilsonian models. Business leaders warned of the hazard facing industrialists in the newly realized political power of the masses and the need to wage and win the everlasting battle for the minds of men and indoctrinate citizens with the capitalist story, to manipulate public opinion to see business as the essence of American life, essentially what the conquest or the church was to people of other ages. These are all quotes from the business press. And so on, and quite an impressive flow, accompanied by even more impressive efforts extending to every corner of human existence. This is surely one of the major themes of modern history, but very marginally studied, and again, with no professional home. Interesting fact. It's kind of an institutional form of self-defense, not to investigate this topic. It doesn't require a decision. It's just one of those things that you know you're not supposed to think when you get a good education, as Orwell put it in his suppressed essay. The basic problem goes way back. It's clearly posed in Aristotle's Politics, the founding document of political theory. Aristotle, as you know, favored democracy, but he perceived fundamental flaws if wealth is narrowly concentrated. The one flaw was that free men would not be able to participate meaningfully, but even if they did, the poor majority would seek the interest of the needy, not the common good of all. That's Aristotle. James Madison raised the same dilemma in the debates of the Constitutional Convention, which are incidentally far more interesting than the Federalist Papers, which, remember, were basically a work of propaganda. The debates in the convention are much more revealing. He raised the same dilemma there. He pointed out that if the public had political rights, they would carry out such measures as agrarian reform, pursuing the interests of the needy. Well, facing the conflict, the same conflict between inequality and democracy, Aristotle and Madison drew opposite conclusions. Aristotle concluded that poverty should be reduced so that most people would have moderate and sufficient property in a community of equals aiming at the best life possible for all. That's Aristotle. He went on to say that the government must not only be democratic and participatory, but also what nowadays we would call a welfare state that provides lasting prosperity to the poor by distribution of public revenues by a variety of means that he described. Madison faced the same dilemma and drew the opposite conclusion. Democracy must be reduced, and power must be left in the hands of the wealth of the nation so that the state can protect the minority of the opulent from the majority, in his words at the convention. The conflict between Aristotelian and Madisonian conceptions runs a complex course right up to the present, and a good deal of contemporary history falls into place, I think, when we attend to these matters, including a crucial issue that was ignored by both Aristotle and Madison, and is only coming to be addressed in our own lifetimes, namely the concept of community of free men and what it excludes. The record of the past 350 years since the first modern democratic revolutions, I think that suggests a modification of David Hume's principle in his Foundations of Government, that government is founded, he said, on control of opinion only, a maxim that extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well as to the most free and most popular. Logic alone suggests that it's to the more free and popular societies that the maxim most forcefully applies. The device is less needed when people can be controlled by force and terror. I suspect that that accounts for the difference between Bolshevik doctrine and practice and democratic doctrine and practice in the same years. The historical record in general reveals a general accord between practice and logic, I think. If that's so, and I think it is, we should expect to find more significant barriers to self-appraisal in more free and more powerful societies. Well, here we turn to another topic, close analysis of particular cases. I can only barely sample, of course. England and its former colonies are the most interesting and important cases. Simple reason is their freedom, their relative freedom, and their power. And that record is kind of instructive. I mentioned the fears that were aroused in England by the rascal multitude of the mid-17th century who were trying to control their own affairs and had to be protected from that. Well, that contempt carried over quite easily to the colonies, although there were problems, and they were recognized right off. One problem was the recognition that England would have a hard time competing with China, India, and other Eastern countries. I'm quoting Daniel Defoe in 1728. The reason was that they have the most extended manufacture and the greatest variety in the world, and their manufacturers push themselves upon the world by the mere stress of their cheapness. Contemporary research indicates that at least India may have also had the highest living standards among workers in the world, and in fact maybe the best conditions. So it wasn't just cheap labor. The first major problem that Britain faced was textiles. You know, it's the beginning of every industrial development, but it went well beyond. In the case of India, it extended to iron and steel, shipbuilding, many other industries, including, incidentally, advanced technologies. But British force, which imposed liberalization upon India while exempting the imperial overlord, did succeed in converting the industrial workshop and trading center of the world to a deeply impoverished agricultural society, suffering a sharp decline in real wages, food consumption, and availability of other simple commodities, a misfortune that is unprecedented in the world's economic history, conclusion of the most detailed modern study that I know. Well, as Defoe recognized in 1728, China posed a similar problem. Here, the British didn't take over until the mid-19th century opium wars. And the problem that they faced was explained by a British government analyst in Hong Kong in 1854, analyzing the textile problem. Britain, he reported, was about to start in competition with the greatest manufacturing people of the world, not yet destroyed as India had been by a century of British rule. British goods, he concluded, are inferior and too expensive. Native Chinese cloth cannot be produced at the same rates in Manchester, let alone sold to China. We can bring them nothing except our opium, which is the only open sesame to their stony hearts. Historian Jack Gray, who is incidentally quite pro-English, he concludes that the Chinese peasant weaver defeated Lancashire's machines, although British resources of violence ultimately prevailed, as they had in India, and China not only imported British opium, but followed India to disaster. On the side, one might note operative factors of a different character, which really ought to be brought together if there ever develops someday a discipline dealing with these topics. These have been investigated in some rather interesting comparative studies of Asian and Latin American economic development. Quotes from now on. Consumption patterns and elite status competition seem to have been quite different. In Latin America, quoting, with a fervor approaching in some cases insatiability for foreign-owned luxury goods for Western-oriented elites, contrasts with the homegrown status goods orientation of Asian societies serviced by larger and more decentralized skill craft sectors. These are differences which it's claimed persist right to the contemporary period, as Asia in the contemporary period concentrated on building up the physical and human capital base prior to turning to consumer durable production, in contrast to Latin America. I'm quoting international economist David Felix, summarizing his own research and recent anthropological studies of the two societies, which seem to coincide and have interesting effects. Well, returning to Britain and China, it was not, of course, British opium that England used to open the stony hearts of the Chinese. Rather, it was Indian opium. Apart from the innumerable other benefits that India conferred on Britain, at least on some Britons, it also provided the opium that was the staple of Britain's exports to China, and that was no small matter. Jack Gray, again, very pro-British historian, and a good one. He comments that opium sales were the hub of British commerce in the East for a long period. The only competitor to the poison trade, as it was called, was the pig trade. As it was called, it was effectively a slave trade that shipped kidnapped Chinese to California and to Britain's colonies. Well, that story replicates throughout today's Third World, which in the 18th century was much less different from the First World than it is today. Outside Europe, two regions developed, the United States and Japan, which were able to follow an independent course and to adopt the measures of state intervention in the economy and violence that England had pursued, setting a pattern with few exceptions, in fact, none that I know. The consistency of the record is rather impressive, as is the rhetoric of the victors, which merits comparison with the record. Well, that takes us back to the specific concern here, my specific concern, namely the self-appraisal of the victors. British conquests were accompanied by a remarkable record of triumphalism and self-glorification. The details are interesting. I'll skip them for lack of time, but it's really astonishing and well worth a close look. My guess is that it may have a claim to be another cultural universal. Let me sample from the other great 20th century economy, Japan. The Japanese in Manchuria sought only, I'm quoting from their documents, sought only to liberate the masses and bring them a righteous government. The leadership recognized that the program had to be pursued mercilessly, inhumanely, without emotion, as if driving a horse, but that was only because of the terror of the Chinese bandits who were trying to bar Japan's noble efforts to lead the suffering people to an earthly paradise. All of that's very familiar, incidentally, in Western history, including our own. The record of benevolence has not passed entirely unnoticed. For example, writing from a British prison cell, Nehru expressed his thanks for the solicitude which British industrialists and economists have shown for the Indian peasant and the tender care lavished upon him by the British government in India, from which one can only conclude that some all-powerful and malign fate, some supernatural agency, has countered their intentions and measures and made that peasant one of the poorest and most miserable beings on earth. It was the calm assurance of the conquerors of always being in the right that most outraged Nehru, who incidentally was something of an Anglophile. It's an important fact that this calm assurance of always being in the right infected even those of the highest integrity and intelligence. So take, for example, John Stuart Mill. It would be extremely hard to find anyone to match him in these qualities of morality and mind. At least I can't think of anyone, any leading figure. There are a lot of ordinary people who are like that, but it's a different story. I'm talking about extraordinary people. In 1859, Mill wrote an interesting essay on a topic that's right at the forefront of current discussion, humanitarian intervention. Mill was critical of the prevailing view in England that the world's dominant power should not intervene unless its own interests were under threat. He explained that Britain is unlike all other nations. It has no crass notions, and its policies are blameless and laudable. He says this is hard for others to comprehend, so they attribute base motives to the British, who seek only fraternal equality with the whole human race. And it follows that it would therefore be wrong for this angelic power to refrain from intervention on grounds of laws of international morality that bar such action. I leave it as an exercise to the reader to translate that into today's articles. These laws of international morality, what we call international law, Mill explained, they don't hold for conflicts between civilized nations and barbarians. The barbarians have no national rights, and it is therefore ridiculous, he said, to criticize the behavior of the French in Algeria or the English in India. These and other barbarians need the protection of a civilized power of Christian Europe, particularly the noblest among them. Well, the date of Mill's essay is significant, 1859. He was writing just at the time of the public exposure of Britain's atrocities in suppressing the Indian uprising of 1858, which were pretty horrendous and well publicized in parliamentary discussions and elsewhere. Mill doesn't have a word about them, or others at the same time, including the Second Opium Wars, which were then underway. Mill must have been aware of the bitter condemnations in Parliament of Britain's renewed attack on China. For example, Gladstone's denunciation of the opium trade, or Lord Derby's denunciation of the pretext for the war as the most despicable cause of war that has ever occurred. Of course, Mill could not have known of Lord Elgin's destruction of the Summer Palace in Peking after the pillage of its artistic treasures, because that took place a few months after his call for British intervention to protect the barbarians. Nor could he know, although he might have guessed, that Britain's opium exports from India, mostly to China, would almost double in the next 20 years, as Britain took over 7/8 of the trade that China was now forced to accept, following the path of India, Egypt, and others, unable to escape the rule of the civilized world. Well, I've largely kept away from today's richest and most powerful state, but I think the lessons are not hard to draw. It's long been conventional in U.S. discourse, academic and other, to describe U.S. policies as guided by Wilsonian idealism, as it's called, while at the other extreme, people who call themselves realists object that we lack the means to conduct our crusades of global meliorism and should not neglect our own interests in the service of others. And within this range, respectable discussion can proceed. We've now passed beyond that framework. Respected commentators now explain that U.S. foreign policy has entered a noble phase, even acquiring a saintly glow. All of these, incidentally, are quotes from recent reviews of the topic by respected academic and intellectuals, other intellectuals in the New York Times, but the ideas are pretty common, and they will not be unfamiliar to people who have studied the canon or what ought to be in the canon. Well, these are very natural concomitants of unchallenged power, and very dangerous ones. Furthermore, contemporary triumphalism goes far beyond the saintly glow of foreign policy. There's another strand that's articulated most clearly in the business press, which records what it calls capital's clear subjugation of labor for 15 years and the radical shift in the economic balance of power between management and workers. Contemporary triumphalism is rather typical of its predecessors in that it's not shared by the general public, but rather it's concentrated among those who are the victors, both internationally and domestically. Well, here we open up other dimensions of self-appraisal, which I'll have to put aside, not for lack of importance. Let me just conclude with a few words about the noble phase of our international relations and its saintly glow. Well, again, can't undertake a review of representative cases, so let me select just one, which is in fact the fair one. It's the one that's offered as a prize example of the principles that have emerged victorious And it also illustrates rather well these Millian doctrines that I just reviewed. The end of the Cold War was widely hailed as a victory of democracy and open markets, and an opportunity for a new mission to consolidate the victory. And that's a conventional picture. These words happen to be those of National Security Advisor Anthony Lake discussing the Clinton Doctrine, which he had announced at Johns Hopkins in September 1993. A year later, US troops landed in Haiti to restore democracy. That was a dramatic affirmation of the new doctrine of enlargement of market democracy, as Lake described the mission. Sidney Mintz published an article assessing the prospects right then. He considered them dim unless the United States would allow fundamental economic change in the distribution of power to make economic decisions, meaning a shift to the hands of the general public away from foreign investors and wealthy Haitians. Well, that would require steps towards authentic democracy. In fact, democracy of the kind that was taking shape 10 years ago, sweeping Jean-Bertrand Aristide into power in the only genuine election in Haiti's history. That surprising event brought into office a government with an active and organized popular base. You could argue that it was the only one in the hemisphere. It wouldn't be an exaggeration. It began to address some of the deep-seated problems of Haitian society, successfully enough to win the plaudits even of the international financial institutions. It also elicited the instant hostility of the US government, which moved at once to undermine the government and its populist reforms. US refugee policy also changed. For the preceding 10 years, in radical violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Washington had been forcibly returning Haitian refugees to their US-backed torture chamber. When democracy arrived, terror sharply declined, and the refugee flow reduced to a trickle. Washington's policies reversed as well. The few people leaving the genuine democracy now qualified as political refugees, and they were granted asylum claims at 50 times the rate of the years of terror that preceded. Human rights practices in Washington returned to the norm after Aristide was overthrown by a military coup and the terror revived. The island was blockaded, illegally of course, and tens of thousands of refugees were returned to their fate as before the democratic interlude. Instructive reflection of what policy was general. Haiti's elected president was finally allowed to return, as Lake pointed out, but only after the popular organizations had been subjected to 3 years of merciless terror by forces that retained close connections to Washington throughout. The Clinton administration is still refusing to turn over to Haiti tens of thousands, an estimated 160,000 pages of documents on state terror that were seized by the US military forces to avoid embarrassing revelations about Washington's involvement with the coup regime, according to Human Rights Watch, which has seen some of the documents. As a condition on his return, Aristide was compelled to accept an economic program dictated by Washington. I'm now quoting it. It directs the policies of the Haitian government to the needs of civil society, especially the private sector, both national and foreign. Okay. Civil society, especially the private sector, both national and foreign. So US investors are the core of Haitian civil society, along with wealthy Haitians who backed the military coup, but not the Haitian peasants and slum dwellers, who organized a civil society so lively and vibrant that they were able to elect their own president against overwhelming odds, eliciting instant US hostility. The policy on returning the president was explained by Strode Talbot, who's speaking for the State Department to Congress. He assured a Senate committee that even after US troops left Haiti, quoting, "We will remain in charge by means of US aid in the private sector." Haitian civil society, in other words. A little history is helpful here. Haiti's liberation was one of the 3 major revolutions of what's called the Age of Revolutions. 2 of them had the sloganeering Sidney Mintz points out, but only the third brought the freedom that was preached by the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, as scandalizing them and everyone else. Ever since, he goes on to discuss, Haitians have been punished for the crime of true emancipation and for refusing to tolerate the social and economic structure European intentions had installed in what was at the time a supremely profitable colony, comparable perhaps only to Bengal, which is today's Bangladesh, facts that might elicit some further thoughts. Rolf Trouillot has written very eloquently on the silencing of Haiti's revolution. The Haitian Revolution, he shows, was unthinkable, even to the most radical figures of the Enlightenment. They couldn't cope with it as it unfolded. They had no concepts or framework of thought to accommodate general liberation. One of the most remarkable things he points out, to my mind, quoting, is that in 1791, when the unthinkable occurred, there is no public debate on the record in France, in England, or in the United States on the right of black slaves to achieve self-determination and to do so by armed resistance to the terror that they were forced to endure. Since then, Western historians have avoided the unthinkable story by what he calls formulas of silence, erasure, or trivialization. Meanwhile, Haitians continued to shock respectable opinion, again in 1990. Well, the unthinkable acts of Haitian peasants and slum dwellers who instituted meaningful democracy, shocking the men of best quality, as such things had been doing for 350 years. They were reversed by violence with direct U.S. complicity, not only through contacts with the state terrorists in charge. The Organization of American States declared an embargo. The Bush and even more the Clinton administration undermined it right away by exempting U.S. firms. They claimed to freeze the assets of coup leaders, but they delayed long enough so that when the assets of the chief of staff of the murderous Haitian army were finally attached by the Bank of Boston, they found $5. Clifford Grant, the wealthy coffee baron, who was on Washington's list of supporters of the military terror, he not only kept his assets and his property, but he showed up in Miami in March 1994 to buy a $50,000 Cadillac. The U.S. continued to train Haitian military officers and provide arms, and is still protecting the worst killers right now. International tribunals are for someone else, not for people whose ties to Washington are so close, let alone those who orchestrate major atrocities for their home base, from their home base. Well, Washington's most serious violation of the embargo was none of the above. The most serious one was the secret authorization that was granted to the Texaco Oil Company by both Bush and Clinton to supply the coup regime and its wealthy supporters. Oil is at the core of any embargo, and Texaco was informed that although it was illegal, they could do it and nothing would happen. These crucial facts were very prominently revealed the day before U.S. troops landed to restore democracy. Impossible that any newsroom didn't see them. Same place I did, on the AP wires, where they were the lead story. But they have yet to reach the American public, and they are very unlikely candidates for the historical record, in my opinion. Prediction. As I said, predictions are not very high probability, but I'm willing to bet a little on this one. In brief, sanctions were not for the rich and the killers, or for U.S. businesses, but only for the traditional victims. Well, now democracy has been restored. The new government has been forced to abandon the democratic and reformist programs that offended Washington and to follow the policies of Washington's candidate in the 1990 election, in which he received 14% of the vote. There is no thought of the change in the distribution of power that Mintz described as essential to reversing the drift to deeper misery. Actually, the story becomes even more grim when we look more closely and look at the economic policies that Washington is now imposing. These are actually extensions of the aid programs of the 1970s and 80s. These were going to turn Haiti into the Taiwan of the Caribbean, Washington confidently proclaimed, surely knowing that Taiwan had followed a radically different course. The programs devastated the population still further while enriching the usual beneficiaries. With democracy restored, the U.S. is withholding aid right now to ensure that public assets are handed over to the same beneficiaries under privatization, while the U.S. bars expenditures for health and education. Agribusiness receives plenty of funding, but not peasant agriculture and handicrafts, which provide the income for the overwhelming majority of the population. Foreign-owned assembly plants employ workers, mostly women, at well below subsistence pay and under horrendous conditions. They benefit from cheap electricity, subsidized by the generous supervisor, ultimately our taxes, but for the general population, there can be no subsidies for electricity, fuel, water, or food. They are prohibited on the principal grounds that they constitute price control, and therefore we can't accept them. Before the reforms, so-called, were instituted, local rice production supplied virtually all domestic needs, which has quite important linkages to the whole domestic economy. Thanks to liberalization, it now provides about half of domestic needs with the predictable effects on the economy. As is customary, the liberalization is one-sided. Centuries-old story continues. Haiti has to reform, eliminating tariffs in accord with the stern principles of economic science, which by some miracle of logic exempt U.S. agribusiness. It continues to receive huge public subsidies. These were increased by the Reagan administration to the point where they provided 40% of growers' gross incomes in the United States. Well, the consequences are pretty obvious, and they are understood. A 1995 U.S. aid report observes that the export-driven trade and investment policy that Washington mandates will relentlessly squeeze the domestic rice farmer in Haiti, who will be forced to turn to agro-export, meaning for the benefit of U.S. investors, in accord with the principles of rational expectations theory. Well, by such methods, the most impoverished country in the hemisphere has been turned into a leading purchaser of U.S.-produced rice, enriching publicly subsidized U.S. enterprises. Well, those who've had a good education will know how to prove that the benefits will trickle down to Haitian peasants and slum dwellers ultimately. Meanwhile, Haitians continue to scandalize the West by resisting these reforms, in fact joined by great numbers of people around the world, although there are very few voices for the voiceless, and their voices very rarely reach the corridors of privilege and power, those in which most of us live. In the case of Haiti, I think it would not be unrealistic to regard these developments as just the latest phase of a conflict going back centuries in the region between forceful insertion in Western economies to serve their objectives and the efforts within first slave and later free societies to create a domestic market economy with successes under extreme adversity that even today continue to attest to the vitality and resourcefulness of people who have suffered a historical experience, surely the most bitter in modern times. Quoting Sidney Mintz again. That's an experience that we should hardly contemplate with pride, and that can become different if we so choose. Well, remember that this was the prize example offered of the noble phase of humanitarian intervention. Looking back at it, it helps us to understand ourselves a little better, if we choose to learn. The similarity to England in its day in the sun is close. Perhaps it should be too close for comfort. Well, I began these remarks with a virtual truism. The more free and democratic the society in which we live, the greater our share in privilege within it, the greater its power, the more significant is the task of understanding ourselves. I mentioned two illustrations. England at the peak of its might in the last century, ourselves right now. My personal conviction is that these cases illustrate conclusions of considerable generality. In particular, that the capacity for honest self-appraisal tends to decline as its significance increases. The efforts to gain what's sometimes called understanding of otherness are an impressive achievement of modern thought. Understanding of selfness lags well behind, particularly within the circles of privilege to which most of us belong. Well, that's hardly a novel thought. The great American radical pacifist A.J. Muste observed many years ago that the problem after a war is with the victor. He thinks he has just proved that war and violence pay. Who will now teach him a lesson? That observation generalizes to conflict quite generally, I think, and merits particular reflection on the part of the victors, or those who see themselves in that light. Thanks.
Chomsky will now answer a few questions and entertain exchanges with the audience. Just for 10 to 15 minutes, I'd like to point to this gentleman standing here in the middle of the room. If you want to ask a question, you will have to get the microphone from him and address your question from the floor.
Anyone in this area? What's your question? Anyone at all?
Back there.
I can ask about this.
Well, but people won't be able to hear you.
In few words, could you possibly state the basic reasons which you understand was the conflict in Yugoslavia in past years, and
State basic reason for what?
for the conflict in Yugoslavia?
The conflict in Yugoslavia?
Yes. And the second part is, could you also refer to work of yours which dealt with this?
Could I refer to the work of mine which dealt with the conflict in Yugoslavia? I've written nothing but simple, conventional comments about it. There is no work of mine that deals with it. That's interesting. It's a worthwhile topic to study. There's been an enormous amount of work on it, of varying quality. And since it was such a major focus of attention, I didn't feel that it was an important issue for me to pick up. I'd rather discuss things that aren't being discussed. I think this was a major issue of a huge issue for the West for several reasons. One of them was that it was a real atrocity. But the other and more important one was it was an atrocity you could blame on someone else. There were other atrocities of a comparable sort going on, maybe often worse, going on at the very same time, which did not elicit anything like that attention. So, for example, while Sarajevo was being bombarded with a terrible cost for its inhabitants, Quito was being bombarded much more heavily, with many more people killed. And I don't remember much about that. Or intellectuals going to Quito to show their solidarity for the people and so on. Well, some reasons. For one thing, they were black, not white. For another, the bombardment was by our man, the freedom fighter who the United States had extolled as, the great leader of African liberation and poured tons of money to. In fact, Angola generally was devastated in those years. And one can mention quite a few other cases. So this case was extensively, it became a huge issue, as it should have been. It's an atrocity. Atrocities committed by other people are also atrocities. But there is a question why it is so easy for us to concentrate on atrocities by others about which we can do nothing, rather than on atrocities, often worse ones, of our own, about which we can do quite a lot. That's a question that happens to interest me. On the facts of the matter about the background in Yugoslavia, we could have a long discussion. In my own frank opinion, if you would like. The reasons for it are too complicated to discuss. They go way back. I could go right back to the Second World War and probably much deeper. I'm sure much deeper. But as far as U.S. policy is concerned, I think it was pretty clear what it was from the beginning. U.S. policy was to stay away as long as it was ugly, and to let other people do the dirty work. So as long as the fighting was going on, and there were problems of relief and so on and so forth, okay, leave it to the Canadians or, you know, the UN or somebody like that. No U.S. forces involved. The idea of intervention in Bosnia was considered by no one, zero. In fact, there was it's interesting that there was one country that offered to intervene and could have done it, and could have stopped the attack on Bosnia. And the only effort it would have taken by the United States was to provide some logistic aid. But no one ever considered that possibility. With all the talk about intervention, the one feasible possibility was never discussed. That country was Iran. Iran offered to intervene to protect Bosnia. It had the military force to do so, undoubtedly. It would have required, you know, a couple of military air transports from the U.S., nothing much more. That probably would have worked. Did anybody discuss it? No. That shows you how serious they were about military intervention to protect the Bosnians. The United States stayed in the background until the issue was sort of resolving itself in the way in which I think both the U.S. and Western Europe wanted it to, namely with effective partition of the former Yugoslavia into a kind of greater Croatia and greater Serbia. And at that point, the U.S., which had helped to bring about that balance, did intervene. After the fighting was over, two sides had exhausted themselves. They were more or less equal in military, equalized to a large extent in military force. It was therefore possible for the United States to go in and pick up the pieces, much to the discomfiture of Europe, I should say. The Germans and the French didn't like it a bit. You know, there's a conflict going on as to who's going to dominate that region, and the U.S. intervention to essentially, you know, carry out the final stages of the partition, which is what it amounts to, were not greeted with great applause by European rivals. But they do amount to a sort of a small-scale power play, which leaves the United States in a influential, if not dominant, position in a significant region. It's part of a region which the United States has always regarded as part of the periphery of the Middle East oil-producing area, always, and also has significance for Central Asia and Eastern Europe. And I think that's essentially U.S. policy. As for the sources of the conflict, that's another story, and as I say, there's interesting literature on that.
Somewhere here.
Maybe. Could you speak on, I'll stand. Could you speak on, you were talking about the privatization in Haiti. When I was there before out-of-state returned, some of the activists were talking about privatization and the impact on the people. And you also talked about how the U.S. was angry because the people elected out-of-state. Could you talk about the correlation between the Haitian situation and the present situation with privatization in Washington, D.C., right down the street? The effect of the political lynching that's happened to the people that the U.S. government never forgave us for re-electing, who was Marion Barry, and the correlation between those two.
Yeah. I wish I could, but I strongly suspect that you could say a lot more about it than I can. I don't know the local Washington situation well enough to talk about it, and I don't like to talk about things I haven't really looked at closely, so I have only superficial impressions, much less interesting than yours, I'm sure.
We'd appreciate it if you did look at
Yeah, I should. There are a lot. I agree with that, but I haven't. So, yeah, it's an interesting point.
One back here.
How would you compare the British Opium Wars to the
Pardon?
How would you compare the British Opium Wars to the influx of tobacco, American tobacco,
Influx of
tobacco
today?
into Southeast Asia?
Oh, it's virtually the same thing. That's not only my opinion. It was the opinion of the Surgeon General of the United States, the very respectably conservative Everett Koop, in congressional hearings, which were silenced by the media. It's an interesting story. I have written about it. In September, I think it was September 1989, the Bush administration declared the latest phase of the drug war. This drug war is called every few years. And this was a big one, you may remember, a big television announcement, war to the death against drugs and so on and so forth. I surveyed the AP wires for the next month just to see what was going to happen. It turned out that about 50, I have to go back and look at the data, so this may be a little off, but something like this. There was more coverage of drugs in the following month than of all foreign news combined, something like that. There was a complete shift in the coverage of the media to the war against drugs. Prior to that, it had not been a big issue, nor was it a big issue among the American public. So when people were asked shortly before to list, the problems that they faced, drugs was quite low on the list. But after a month of this huge propaganda offensive, drugs was way high on the list. Well, the reasons for the drug war are interesting to look into, and if you want, it doesn't have anything to do with the war against drugs. It's a war, but not against drugs. But relevant to your point, at the very same time that this was going on, right in that same month, Congress, the U.S. trade representative was holding hearings on an appeal by the U.S. tobacco companies to impose heavy sanctions against Thailand at that time, extending ones that are even threatened against Korea, and Taiwan, and so on, and Japan, to impose sanctions on them because they were trying to restrict advertising of U.S. cigarettes to domestic populations, in fact, primarily women and children. So here's what was going on. U.S. tobacco companies are petitioning Congress to force Southeast Asian countries not only to accept U.S. lethal drugs, and very lethal drugs, in fact, not only to accept U.S. lethal drugs, but to accept advertising for them aimed at vulnerable populations. And if they don't do it, we resort to, Super 301, we close the American market and they collapse. Okay, all of this was happening at the same time. It was a total scandal, The hearings were not reported. In fact, the only report I saw of them was something in the Wall Street Journal. Virtually nothing, actually, I wrote about. They were kind of reported around the fringes, like I wrote about them, and so on. But in the mainstream, it was silence. And they were very visible, to the extent that Everett Koop, and you can't find a more respectable conservative figure, he drew exactly your comparison. He said, look, this is just like the Opium Wars. We are forcing Southeast Asia, East and Southeast Asia, to accept not only import of our lethal substances, but even advertising for it. And we're doing it, and if they don't do it, we're going to close off our market to them, which is really lethal. The reporting on the so-called drug war, you can compare with the reporting on this new opium war, which is just the latest phase of a long effort. U.S. tobacco companies have realized for a long time that they don't have much of a future in the United States. Through the 1980s, from about 1980 on, the use of substances generally, it's a pretty broad category, including tobacco, marijuana, coffee, red meat, a whole variety of things, began a steady decline. It starts around 1980, steady decline among educated sectors of the population. Okay. On the other hand, use of, say, tobacco and cocaine and so on remained pretty steady among poor sectors, which means largely black sectors. right at the point where those curves were going like that, Congress declared the drug war. It's perfectly obvious what it was going to be. It was going to be a war against poor people and black people. In fact, that was stated very explicitly right on the floor of Congress, for example, by Daniel Moynihan. He said what we were doing is legislating a war to criminalize the poor and the blacks. Because the marijuana use peaked in the late 70s, but criminalization was very low, because that was folks like you know, children of nice white people, and you don't send them to jail. But after all substance use of this category started to decline, along with marijuana and cocaine and heroin and everything else, you could predict it was going to continue to go down. So among this sector of the population, you would certainly be able to declare the drug war a victory 2 years from now. The decline is continuing. But meanwhile, you would be targeting the poor and black population where it's not declining. And that was done. There are a lot of other factors that led in the same direction. It has actually been rather well studied by criminologists, including William Chambliss at George Washington University. He's done very good studies on this. And it's perfectly obvious what was happening. Well, that's the so-called drug war here. It's also used for counterinsurgency abroad. But at the same time, the U.S. is forcing extremely harmful substances, very harmful ones, on other countries. And they are not slight. I mean, in the United States itself, tobacco-related deaths are probably run at about 50 times the deaths of all hard drugs combined. The predictions for countries like, say, China are mind-boggling. There's one well-known Oxford University epidemiologist who estimated that if tobacco use continues at current rates in China, about 50 million people now alive will die from it. That's a fairly substantial number, even by the standards of this century. There's a long story. I will refer you to Sidney. Mintz's scholarly work on this. This is related to the role of the Caribbean region in Western European economic development, which, as he points out, the Caribbean region is kind of a source of soft drugs. I think it's the phrase, something like that. Kind of soft drugs to keep the Western European working class under control while they were suffering the cost of industrialization. That's a big piece of the history of the Caribbean region and the West, and here we just have another example. But yeah, you're right, it was very much like the Opium War, and that was pointed out at the time. Everywhere except the press. Actually, the medical journals reported it too. If you take a look at the medical literature, there are medical journals in the medical literature making exactly the same point. Oh, I lost track of what I was trying to say at one point. The tobacco companies have recognized that they're going to lose out in the American market. So what they've been doing is two things: diversifying. So now they sell cereal and all kind of other things. And also targeting foreign markets, vulnerable foreign markets, like Eastern Europe or China or Southeast Asia. And they do that with plenty of clout, because the US government is behind them, forcing other countries to accept these drugs. So their profits are going up fine, but more from killing foreign people than killing domestic people. I might add as a final note on this that Edward Bernays, who I cited, who's highly respected, and in fact, kind of like Mill, very respectable and honorable person, Roosevelt Kennedy liberal, and one of the founders of the U.S. public relations industry, the guy I was quoting before. His first great success, which sort of sent him off into orbit, was a campaign in the 1920s to try to get women to smoke. Women weren't smoking much in those days. And I think he was working for Chesterfield, Lucky Strike, and was funding tobacco and all that kind of stuff. And he started a big advertising campaign, which showed, the usual things, models, movie actresses smoking cigarettes and all that kind of thing. The idea was to popularize this habit among women, and apparently was successful. Can estimate the number of corpses.
Yeah, as we look at the current UN tribunal going on in The Hague and the one going on in Arusha, Tanzania.
I'm sorry.
As we look at the current UN tribunal going on in The Hague, and then
Current UN tribunal going on
in The
in
Hague
Hague about what?
about the Yugoslavia
About
massacre,
Yugoslavia, yeah.
and the one going on in Arusha, Tanzania about the massacre in Rwanda. What would be your prediction on the outcome of those tribunals, and as we look at ourselves from your address as ourselves as others, and what will history write as we look at those two?
Well, the one on Yugoslavia, I think you can predict. I mean, like I say, predictions are not high quality, but in this case, I think it's fair to predict. Both the ones on Central Africa and on the Balkans will continue, and they will find some real war criminals, undoubtedly. Some maybe not real, but many real. And they'll do something, whether they'll punish them or not, I don't know, but they'll at least mention them. But they will carefully exclude the Western role. Like, I'd be very surprised if they bring to the tribunals about Rwanda and Burundi the Belgians and Germans and French who were instrumental in carrying out those things for a long, long period, Furthermore, they will not bring to the tribunal the Western intellectuals, including the media, who could have pointed all this out 20 years ago. I mean, the first big massacres in Burundi, which were huge massacres, they were in Burundi, not Rwanda, they were taking place around 1970. And nobody cared, a bunch of black people killing each other. Edward Herman and I wrote a book in which we discussed what we could find about this about 20 years ago. But there was very little about it, although the facts were clear, no big secret about it. But nobody cared, it just was no use. Now it's used, so somebody cares, but the Western role will be ignored. And that's not the only massacre going on in in this region. The UN Commission on Africa, which is a fairly conservative body, they estimate the deaths caused by South African aggression in the 1980s, the Reagan years. They estimate the deaths at about over, I think, 1 million or 1.5 million, something in that neighborhood. I've forgotten the exact number, and the costs at about $60 million. There was huge massacres. This is during the period of what is called here constructive engagement, with the U.S. more or less supporting South Africa for its own reasons. That's pretty substantial, kind of outdoes even the horrors of Rwanda and Burundi. There's not going to be any talk about that, or the people who supported it. So yeah, something will happen as long as you can target somebody else. If you can find an exception to that in history, I'd like to see it. Yet to come across one. And that's our fault. That's not anybody else's fault. Because in more free societies like ours, we're a pretty free, very free society, among more privileged people like most of us are, there's quite a lot you can do about this. And if it continues, you know who to blame.
I would appreciate if you can tell us about your opinion about the current U.S. policy towards Cuba.
Well, Cuba is another case where there aren't going to be any international tribunals. Cuba has been under bitter attack since Castro. Cuba was a Spanish colony, remember? The United States, in fact, is the oldest issue in U.S. foreign policy is Cuba, literally. Back in the 1820s, nice guys like Thomas Jefferson, John Quincy Adams, and so on were trying to figure out how to conquer Cuba. They couldn't do it at the time because there was a deterrent, namely the British fleet. The British were the big enemy in those years, and they were just too powerful. So the suggestion finally made by John Quincy Adams was that we should be patient until Cuba falls into our hands like a ripe fruit by the laws of political gravitation. Meaning, as the relations between Britain and the United States inevitably shift and the U.S. becomes powerful enough to kick the British in the pants, we'll take it, because it's ours. Okay? Well, the time to take it turned out to be the late 1890s, when the Cubans liberated themselves from Spain but quickly were liberated from themselves by the United States, which took Cuba over and turned it into a colony. You know, I mean, they call it a colony, but it was essentially a colony. So things continued until 1959, you know, plantation, haven for gamblers and that sort of thing. In 1959, the Cubans liberated themselves again, January 1959. Within a few months, we now have a lot of records declassified from that period. Within a few months, the United States had decided internally to overthrow the government. By October 1959, planes based in Florida were bombing Cuba. The United States plane didn't know anything about it. You know, we have such a weak military system, we can't tell if planes are flying from Florida to bomb another country. So we never verified. But by March 1960, the U.S. made a formal decision in secret to overthrow the government of Cuba, except that it was added that it had to be done without revealing the U.S. role, because it would be too unpopular in Latin America, and in fact even domestically. Then Kennedy took over and the attack just escalated. I mean, it included invasion, massive terror. I mean, there's some talk about the attempts to assassinate Castro, and the reason why that's mentioned is because it's very minor, and you can make fun of it. You know, you can tell jokes about poison on his beard and stuff. But what wasn't a joke was the ongoing terror that went on constantly. Operation Mongoose was no joke at all. For example, according to the most impeccable sources we have, Raymond Gartoff in this case, at one of the peak moments of the Cuban Missile Crisis, dangerous moment, one of Kennedy's Mongoose teams blew up a petrochemical factory in Cuba, apparently killing about 400 people. Well, you know, if that had happened in the United States, we would have nuked the world. But fortunately, Cubans and Russians didn't do anything. And so it continued. And in fact, it still does continue. I mean, there's still ongoing terror. In addition to terror, there's been an embargo, and which is extremely fierce. I mean, when you just look at the relative power of Cuba and the United States, you know, and the way in which Cuba fits into the Western hemisphere economy dominated by the United States. And you can see very easily the effect of an extremely harsh, in fact, the harshest embargo in the world. It actually bars food and medicine. Washington claims that it doesn't, but you take a look, it bars food and medicine. By making it so hard to send them, you effectively can't do it. You know? There was just a big study, a couple hundred pages, by the Professional Association of Public Health Workers in the United States, if you know what it's called, American Association of Public Health or something like that. You know, somebody remember the name? Something like that. Big, interesting study, a couple hundred pages, discusses in considerable detail the effects of the U.S. embargo. They went to Cuba and did an investigation, studied the effects of the embargo on medical and health situation. They point out that if this had been any other country, it would have been a total catastrophe. The Cuban internal situation, the Cuban social system is sufficiently resilient and developed so that they were able in various ways to compensate for it. I mean, amazingly, Cuba still ranks right next to the United States in terms of such indices as, say, child mortality under 5 and other things like that, which is something we really ought to be fantastically ashamed about. You know, you consider the wealth of this society and that one. But despite that, the effects of the embargo were severe. I mean, they talk about children, you know, it's very graphic descriptions. You should really read it. You know, children in hospital beds screaming in pain because they can't get medicines that would be easy to supply. The United States has specifically attempted to destroy the Cuban biotechnology industry, which is quite developed and has a lot of interest in the world. Harming also Americans, incidentally, because their industry could be helpful here. But it doesn't matter. The important thing is to strangle them and destroy them. This is an extremely fierce embargo, very vicious. It continues, and the idea is to ensure that our first colony from back in the 1820s goes right back into our pocket. You know? And this goes on. The United States is totally isolated in the world on this one. I mean, it's denounced by the European Union. It's been called illegal by the Organization of American States, which is usually a completely pliable instrument of American policy. Everybody's afraid of the United States. But in this case, it was referred to their International Legal Committee, and they said, yeah, totally illegal. All of our allies have declared it illegal. I mean, even our own colonies break the embargo, like Israel, which is like an extension of the United States, not even a country. But they're breaking the embargo and trading with Israel. With Cuba. That's not a joke, incidentally. I just took the relations. In fact, nobody's doing it except the United States. At the international forums, the votes are always, everyone versus two, United States and Israel. But that's an automatic vote, even though they're breaking the embargo. But the United States is continuing, and there is amazingly no public pressure about it here, or very little public pressure here. Well, again, we know exactly who to blame on this. I mean, if Cuban children are screaming in pain in hospital beds because they can't get medicines, you and I know exactly who to blame. This doesn't have to happen.
At the beginning of your talk, you made reference to
last question. That will be the last question.
Okay, I'm sorry. At the beginning of your talk, you made reference to dualist conception of mind and brain. Made reference to Descartes and Newton's authority on the subject. And it seems to me that with your political discussions, you emphasize this fact in order to show the role that power and culture and whatnot shapes.
Actually, I was trying to make a different point. Maybe I didn't make it very well. The point I was trying to make is that understanding the world is no easy business. In fact, understanding the simplest things in the world, like terrestrial motion, turns out to be impossible to human intelligence in the sense of understanding that animated the modern scientific revolution. That teaches some humility when you get to harder questions. I mean, that's the point I was trying to make.
Would you then cast any doubts on our potential ability in examining neurophysiological brain structure and whatnot and asking meaningful evolutionary questions about the origins of consciousness? Do you think this is...
Well, consciousness there isn't any point talking about. You can't answer far simpler. See, it's kind of interesting that there's a lot of, in the public sphere, there's a lot of sort of pop discussion of completely insoluble problems. But there are much simpler problems that can't be solved. Much simpler ones. I mean, maybe they can be, but they're certainly beyond current science. So take, say, there's a lot of talk about the neurophysiology of human higher mental faculties. Okay, how about the neurophysiology or the physiology of higher mental faculties of bees? Okay, the bees are somewhat simpler than humans. Okay? Bees have a very elaborate communication system. In fact, it's about the only one in the organic world that shares any non-trivial properties with human language, and they're pretty trivial. And it's been very well studied. I mean, the bee communication system has been studied down to fine detail. People know what every waggle of this wing is and all that kind of business. And nobody has a clue as to how the bee does it. There's not even an idea about how the physiology works. In fact, let me be clear, there are a few ideas. So, for example, one of the most plausible-looking ideas comes from a mathematician at the University of Rochester who's been studying it for years, who has shown that you can predict a lot of the details of the bee communication system by assuming that it's a three-dimensional projection of a six-dimensional manifold. And she suggested some kind of quantum theoretic explanation of how bees might be able to do this. Well, okay, maybe. But the point is, and it's not considered an absurd proposal. I mean, anything that's understood in nature works like that. Okay. But when you get beyond extremely simple questions, understanding goes down very fast. When you get beyond, it's like at a biology department like, say, MIT, fancy biology department, probably this one too, they don't even teach evolution because there's nothing much to teach. It's kind of like history. You teach population genetics and you teach big molecules and you teach a few other things, but beyond that, it's a really interesting topic. But it's not hard science because we understand enough. When you get to talk about human evolution, well, I quoted Dick Lewontin, but who's one? But What he points out is perfectly sensible. I mean, the tools for the study of evolution require close relatives and variation. You know, but humans are isolated. I mean, in a human, the nearest relatives are about an evolutionary distance of 15 to 20 million years. That's a lot of distance. And human higher mental qualities evolved in the last, you know, kind of eye blink of this period of separation. When I say 15 to 20 million years, I'm doubling the time of the point of separation, because remember, they both keep evolving, okay? So it's 50 to 20 million years of actual biological separation. The things we're talking about humans are the very last instant of this period. So like, you know, at roughly 15 to 20 million years of distance from the nearest relative. Among humans themselves, there is virtually no known variation, apart from pathology. You know? So humans are extremely, as far as anybody understands, extremely uniform in higher mental qualities. So you don't get internal variation of any significant kind, at least not that anyone knows, and you have no relatives. So there's nothing to study.
Although we are certainly unique, shouldn't we look for, shouldn't we at least look in our other members of our evolutionary line for the precursors?
Who, for example? Dolphins?
Even, you mentioned bees, even.
Bees. Don't we look at bees. Bees share some properties with humans, but the evolutionary distance is 1 billion years.
But
numbers like that don't mean anything in biology.
Isn't it possible that language can perform the same functions in bees, for example, that it does, obviously not to as complex a level as it does in humans?
Yeah, and it's maybe so, but that's let's say, I mean, I don't think it does, but in fact it performs richer functions than human language, because there's respects in which the bee system is richer than human language. In fact, infinitely richer, if not a small amount. So if you look at the bee system, it's continuous. So between any two messages that a bee conveys, there's another message that it can convey. That's not true of human language, it's discrete. So between 6-word sentences and 7-word sentences, there isn't any 6.5-word sentence. So you could argue from some points of view that the bee system's even richer than ours. This is totally meaningless. Furthermore, even if you find some comparisons, what would it mean to find a comparison separated by 1 billion years of evolution with nothing in between? I mean, this isn't even pop Darwinism, it's nonsense. I mean, the fact that it dominates discussion is amazing. I mean, it's not to say that you shouldn't look for investigation of the neurophysiology of higher mental faculties. Sure, look, I mean, we've got a project in the department doing it, and I'm working on it, in fact. The things that you can study are very marginal. You know, the problem, and there are many much simpler questions than this that you don't even begin to know how to study. It's an interesting question why this stuff is so popular. In fact, the only ideas that are around, like say Francis Crick's, you know, that it's his astonishing hypothesis that that consciousness is just the result of the organical structure of the brain. That's not only true, but it is a truism, and it was a truism 2 centuries ago. I mean, that was suggested by John Locke, and it had become a truth. In fact, it's called Locke's suggestion in the philosophical literature. And by the end of the 18th century, it was being proposed by mainstream scientists, you know, Joseph Priestley and others, for the simple reason that there's no other possibility. You know, there's no other possibility that anybody can dream of, except magic, than saying that, as Priestley put it, he's a well-known, important scientist, that we must assume that the capacities for thought and consciousness are the result of a particular form of organization of the brain, just as electrical attraction and repulsion are, or the effects of motion, which are also incomprehensible. Remember, as Newton showed, they're incomprehensible. But they happen, and they're the results of the nature of matter, and the same must be true about thought and consciousness, and that's the astonishing hypothesis. I mean, why it keeps being revived every few months, I don't know, but it was sort of standard fare a couple of centuries ago, and it derives from a well-known proposal of Locke's. I mean, Locke put it in a kind of theological framework. So what Locke says in the essay is that he says, given the fact that the effects of motion are incomprehensible to us, okay, but they have them. There is no reason to doubt, he says, that God decided to super add to matter, in addition to the mysterious properties that we can't comprehend that account for motion and so on. God might have decided to super add the capacity of thought as another property of matter. That's the theological framework. In the next century, God tended to, decline in status in this discussion, and it became the proposal that the properties of matter just happen to include these incomprehensible effects of attraction and repulsion and chemical affinity and thought and consciousness and human social institutions and everything else. Yeah, they're properties of the world, and there is nothing but a world, so okay, that's matter. And about that, there's nothing to discuss because there's no conceivable alternative. When you ask the question, well, what can I say about any of these things? You quickly discover that when you get beyond complex molecules, you can't say a lot.